All right, everyone. So now we're on to civil liberties. Now, civil liberties are in the Constitution. They're protected by the Constitution. They are not granted by the Constitution. The Constitution only says that government can't make laws that infringe on civil liberties. Governments cannot make laws that violate civil liberties. But remember, the idea of a civil liberty, it's this idea, according to the founders, or the framers, or whatever we want to call them, it's this idea of inalienable rights. It's these rights that cannot be taken away or granted by any other entity other than a man's creator. So these are the kind of the equivalent of God-given rights. These are rights that are natural rights. So civil liberties are these working definitions. They are kind of these things that they're not quite at odds all the time, but let's just kind of break this down so you understand the difference. Civil rights need the government to protect them. Civil rights are rights that government has to step in and guarantee. Civil liberties restrict what government can do, and they restrict government activity to protect the rights of an individual. Now, civil rights can actually be seen to restrict liberties. After all, what about the civil liberties of racists? Those poor oppressed racists. What are we going to do for them with their civil liberties, their preferences to be racist? Aren't they violated? And that's kind of an extreme example, but there are some that are more contentious. There are instances of civil liberties potentially being violated by civil rights that are far more contentious. Arguments are deeply raging about them. And one example is this idea of religious liberties and religious freedoms being violated supposedly by the civil rights of others. What on earth is government to do in such a case? We'll talk about that later. Here is the description of civil liberties in the language of the Supreme Court. The very purpose of a Bill of Rights was to withdraw certain subjects from the vicissitudes of political controversy, to place them beyond the reach of majorities and officials, and to establish them as legal principles to be applied by the courts. The Bill of Rights makes civil liberties something that cannot be removed by any partisan pressure. It is beyond the reach of politics. It is merely for courts to help people maintain their civil liberties and to make sure government does not infringe on them. The Bill of Rights is, of course, a national law. And in the expansion of civil liberties, you see the civil rights brought up again and again and again. The Bill of Rights begins with Congress shall make no law which infringes on the Bill of Rights. This expansion of the Bill of Rights protects individuals from government, but there is no restrictions on what states can do. So this is a very interesting transition. After the Civil War, the national government wants to develop the power to secure these rights over the states. That is, the national government wants to make sure that state governments can't violate the liberties of newly freed slaves. Now, here's John Marshall. The Constitution was ordained and established by the people of the United States for their own government and not for the government of individual states. So that is, the Bill of Rights applies to individuals. It does not apply to states. The Constitution and the rights inherent in it were made for individuals. They were not made to protect states. That is the words of John Marshall. But Congress wanted to change this and give the national legislature more power over state governments. 14th Amendment was one way to do this. Now, this came with privileges and immunities. This is no state shall make any law that infringes on a citizen's privileges and immunities. So this is a power Congress imposes over states. Congress also says states cannot violate due process, and states must provide equal protection for anyone. Now, the Supreme Court has been directly applying the Bill of Rights to the states. So there are some very strange freedoms in the Bill of Rights that don't apply to state action. So like the quartering of troops, that's just like a blanket thing. No government in the United States can make you house the National Guard. That's not something they can do. And there is no prohibition, or there's a statewide, nationwide prohibition against excessive fines. These freedoms were never really violated by the state, so it just never came up. It's only when a problem occurs that the selective incorporation occurs. Most of the time, the Supreme Court has to figure out if something is unconstitutional. There are some cases in which states have to prove their laws are constitutional. These are cases of strict scrutiny, where a new state law comes under strict scrutiny from the national government, usually the courts. Laws that seem to contradict specific prohibitions in the Constitution come under a lot of scrutiny. So, one example, think about this abortion law out of Texas. Of course, the Bill of Rights is not included there, or abortion is not in the Bill of Rights, I should say, but abortion is it's tied to this right to privacy. A right to abortion has been determined by the courts to be a right to privacy issue. So the issue is this new Texas law violating the right to privacy or not? Now, there are other laws which seem to restrict the democratic process. These election laws in Georgia are currently being challenged by the Justice Department. It'll be interesting to see what happens with them at the top level of the courts. And then, of course, sometimes there are laws which seem to discriminate against racial, ethnic, or religious minorities. Notice here, sexual minorities are not on this list. This is something that is changing in our lifetimes. You are starting to see the language of civil rights being applied to LGBTQ people, to trans Americans, but we in this lecture are mainly focused with the first one of these conditions which causes strict scrutiny. Here we go. Privacy. Now, there's a quote from a famous ruling, numbras and emanations. What are those words? Those are fancy words for shadows, gray spaces, dark areas. The right to privacy is not spelled out in the Constitution, but it's implied. It's implied that if you have the freedom of religion, the freedom of movement, the ability to keep troops out of your house, the ability to not incriminate yourself in a crime, that you must have a right to privacy. Now, this theory that the right to privacy is implied in the Constitution was really explained by Justice William O. Douglas, who said that the Bill of Rights and those rights in them have numbers that give them life and substances. So these are the shadows. These shadows create zones of privacy where you, individual citizen, you, individual listener, can make choices without government interference. Now, this is emanations. These are the logical drawing out of other amendments. The Third Amendment banned the quartering of soldiers. This involves privacy without really saying it. So why can't soldiers just decide to come into your home? Because it's your home, it's your space, and you're entitled to it. That is what is implied in this amendment. Now, privacy, again, I kind of hinted at this, but this is Roe v. Wade. So the court says the right to privacy does include the right to have abortion. Turns Roe v. Wade, now Planned Parenthood versus Casey, turns Roe v. Wade into guidelines. States can restrict access to abortion as long as they don't impose an undue burden on choice. Of course, some states have made it harder and harder to get an abortion, and this is where the debate around the Texas law really gets intense. Has this law effectively overturned Roe v. Wade? Does it completely do away from the right to privacy? Now, then privacy and sexuality. States have in the past passed anti-sodomy laws. These anti-sodomy laws have had a deleterious effect, have a bad effect on the LGBTQ community. In 2003, it was ruled that states cannot do this. So finally, my question to you all, what should the role of the court be? Is it always a good idea to stand up to the majority or not? What do you guys think? Here we go. Here's the big one. Freedom of religion. Freedom of religion is a contentious topic, and it will always be a contentious topic. I don't foresee a time in our nation's history where the question of religion will be resolved. Why? Because religion is something deeply, deeply, deeply important to people that have it. Now, what does the Constitution say about religion? Not as much as you would think. The Constitution says people can have their own religion, and the Constitution says that government cannot establish an official religion. Why? Because the King of England had their own religion. This is Anglicanism. This was the power of religion concentrated in the English crown. So, federal government cannot interfere with your individual religious beliefs, but religious actions are not always protected. So, actions can be illegal if they violate a law that serves some compelling purpose. So, for instance, your religion, you cannot sacrifice another person in the United States and claim that that is part of your religious freedom. You will never get away with that because it is, in fact, murder in the eyes of the U.S. law. So, this separation of church and state, this isn't in the Constitution either. This is Thomas Jefferson's opinion. So then the question is, if this is just the opinion of Thomas Jefferson, then what wall really exists between church and state? And what wall should exist? And what do we do as individual citizens, presumably of a great diversity of faiths? Well, we have something called the Lemon Test. So, does law establish religion? Is there a law that favors one religion over others? So, when a new law is passed, we have to ask, does this have a secular or non-religious purpose? Now, this doesn't need to be the primary purpose, just some plausible secular reason for a law. The primary effect must be not to advance or slow down religion. Government must never foster excessive entanglements between the state and religion. So then let's get into some of the problems where this occurs and spell out this logic of the Lemon Test with some examples. So religious displays in public buildings. Can government be seen to endorse one religion? Increasingly, no. No, and this was kind of this was the so-called war on Christmas, right? Where nativity scenes across the nation came down, and you had this question of government, is it endorsing one religion? Now, some communities act or respond to this question differently. Some opted to put up multiple religious displays, some go for more secular holiday displays, and some just keep up these nativity displays. Now, what about religious institutions being free from discrimination laws? Okay, so are you violating the civil liberties of a Catholic school if you punish them for firing gay people? Are you violating the civil liberties of a Christian cake maker for fining him for refusing to serve gay customers for their wedding? These are the murky, contentious questions. This is the big one. And I think right now, in our moment, a lot of these freedom of religion questions have to do with the extent to which religious freedom allows religious organizations and religious individuals to discriminate against the LGBTQ community. I am not, for the record, not saying that religious people discriminate. That is not what I am saying. But I am saying when you see these discussions, that is often how it is framed. Now, what about freedom of speech? Well, when freedom of speech contradicts with another right, usually people side with speech. Speech is the preferred right because democracy requires debate. Now, political speech. This is considered one of the foundations of democracy. Governments can't restrict this right without a compelling reason. So, what are some of these compelling reasons? Well, when somebody says something that constitutes a clear and present danger, yelling fire in a crowded theater, creating conditions where people get into a panic and begin to run over each other, that's dangerous. And no, you can't do that. What about freedom of speech that leads to substantive evil or incites imminent lawless action? Or freedom of speech when it produces such action? This is difficult. Technically, it is illegal to incite crimes. It is illegal to do that. But oftentimes, courts have to prove the intent to do this. And proving that intent is very difficult. This is why prosecuting hate speech is very, very difficult. It is difficult to um, prove that intent. Now, what about symbolic speech, like stomping on the American flag in a form of protest, or waving the American flag in a support of patriotism? Both of these things are okay. Both of these things are defined as a-okay by the laws of the land. Now, what about cross burning? Well, if you're just at home burning a cross for whatever weird reason, in theory, that's okay. But if you are doing that to intimidate, absolutely not. Flag burning. Not a lot of people like it. I have to tell you, I don't like flag burning. I find it to be something, I don't know. Just me personally, I don't like it. It just rubs me the wrong way. It's disagreeable to me. But I cannot ban it just because it's disagreeable to me. What about fighting words? These are words that are trying to get someone to respond violently, protected by the freedom of speech. Student speech is one of the trickiest because schools can regulate speech that is vulgar or offensive. They can impose dress codes banning certain words. They can punish students for saying certain things. And speech that is inconsistent with the educational mission of the school, that can also be banned. Freedom of the press. Let's actually stop off here because I feel this video is running long, and we'll come back here for the last video.